The feather meander quilting design is a great way to take a complex shape like the feather and create an all-over design that looks beautiful on your quilts. Hey, I'm Angela Walters. In this video, I'm going to show you how to quilt the feather meander. This is a great all-over design that uses just one side of the feather to create a curvy, beautiful look. Plus, I'm going to give you some tips and suggestions to give your quilting a beautiful thread-painted look. To find out all the details on the previous videos and the products shown, check the link in the description box below. I'm going to start with a nice open swirl. Now from here, I'm going to go right into my petal, making a teardrop shape and making it look like it's merging into the spine. I'm just going to work my way back around to where I started, quilting those petals until I reach the bottom. I want to fill in that space as much as possible and make those petals nice and round. And you can make these as large or as wide as you want. It really just depends on how dense you want your quilting. There's really no wrong size to quilt them. And when I'm done, I have my first feather meander. And one thing I want to point out is I only have petals on one side of that swirl. Now to add my next little feather, I'm going to use echoing to work my way around until I get to where I want to add that next one. For instance, if I want to add it right here, I can stop, or if I want to keep on going, I can add some more echoes. But this looks like a great place to start. So I'm going to quilt my next feather, making that nice kind of open swirl, and leaving myself room to work my way back out, adding those petals. Quilting that nice half heart shape, and working my way all the way back to the beginning. Now to add the petals of my feather, I'm using the more basic feather technique that we learned in the last video. This design has no traveling and it's nice and quick, making it perfect for an all-over meander. Once I'm done with that nice second one, look how pretty it is, I'm going to do the same, using the echoing to maneuver my way around the area. As you quilt these feathers, you're going to get some of those weird unquilted areas. Just use echoing to fill them in before you move on. And I don't have to echo the feather I've just quilted either. I can echo previously quilted feathers, again, to maneuver around the area and get where I need to add my next one. Now since I'm quilting this as an all-over kind of meander, I'm going to quilt them in a bunch of different directions, not necessarily in a row. Now as I quilt my swirl and I work my way back out, I want to fill in any gaps while I'm there. However, if I leave some unquilted area, I can always echo my way back in and fill it in. The most important thing here is that we just fill in the whole area as much as possible so that we have a nice, beautiful texture. And if you get an area that's just a little too big for echoing but too small to add another feather, you can add swirls or a meandering line just to fill in that area. It really doesn't matter what you put in there as long as you fill it in. And then once it's all filled in, you can move on by quilting your next spine and adding those petals. It doesn't really matter how big or small you make your initial swirl, just try to keep your petals the same size, and that's what's going to give it that nice, consistent density. My spine might be a little bit smaller, a little bit rounder, or I might make it longer and more straightened. It really is fine. If you remember in the troubleshooting common feather frustrations video, I talk about how making your petals too small can be a common frustration. If you find this happening and you're left with a lot of little unquilted area in between the petals, just work your way back in, adding echoing and filling it in. These look better when they're quilted nice and big and curvy, so don't be afraid to really extend it out into that space. And if I'm left with any unquilted area, I'm going to go ahead and handle it while I'm here, echoing my way around, filling in any gaps, and then moving on. Now sometimes you might find that you don't have quite enough room to add your petals. Just quilt until you run out of room, use any echoing to fill it in, and move on. Now let's troubleshoot some common feather meander frustrations. The most common one I see happen with this design is that maybe we don't make our swirl quite round enough. That's not really the end of the world, we're just not going to have a lot of room to add my petals on the inside. It doesn't matter, I'm just going to fit them in where I can and move on. Even if it seems a little weird looking at the moment, eventually we're going to add more echoing and more designs and it's going to look fine. Another common frustration is sometimes when we leave that swirl too open, it might not be obvious which side to work on. For the most part, as I'm adding my petals, I'm working around the outside of this curve where I have lots of room, not necessarily the inside. But if I find myself going on the wrong side of the line, there really is nothing wrong with that. It just doesn't leave you a lot of room to quilt those nice big petals. Even if you pick the wrong side of that line, you can still add echoing and continue on. Or just add some more petals on the other side. Then you'll have a double-sided feather meander. One last common frustration with quilting the feather meander. Sometimes newer quilters will forget to make their petals look like they're merging into the spine. And it can be a little tricky since the spine is usually curling away from us. But if you quilt it so that it's not merging into the spine, instead that it's intersecting, it's just not going to have quite the same look. Is that a problem? Definitely not. Just call it a flower meander and move on. But if you want this particular look, focus on trying to make that half-heart shape look like it's merging into the spine. Try not to get hung up on any perceived imperfections, because once you're all done, it's going to blend into each other and give you that nice all-over design. And once that whole area is filled in, you have a beautiful, curvy feather meander that just looks gorgeous. If you need a little help getting the shape of the feather meander down, check out my Feather Meander Training Wheels Kit. I designed this fabric so that you could quilt on the lines to practice the feather meander and the ribbon candy design. The kit includes the fabric for the front and back as well as the binding. Simply make a quilt sandwich and quilt along the lines. Once you're done, you'll have an adorable whole cloth quilt and will be much more comfortable with this design. Now that we've seen how to quilt this design on the sewing machine, let me demonstrate how to quilt it on the long arm. When it comes to the feather meander, or really any meander, the design is not going to go together any different on a long arm than it does on a sewing machine. The main difference is with the freedom of the movement that comes with the long arm, you might find it difficult quilting this design on a smaller scale. When you're first learning how to quilt it, just quilt it at the size that feels comfortable to you. Then, once you master it, you can start controlling the movement a little bit more and bringing that design to the size that you want it to be. What's great about this design is you can make it look as complex or as basic as you want. Quilt it nice and big and spread out for a beautiful all over, or you can shrink down the space between the lines to really make whatever you're quilting it around pop. As I'm making my way throughout the area, I'm making sure that once I leave an area, it's all filled in. I don't want to have to come back and deal with any gaps. Once I have that section filled in, it's time to start playing around with thread colors to give it that watercolor effect. So first, what I'm going to do is in this area, I'm going to pick a coordinating thread, and I'm going to use that Buttercup Glide that's in the coordinating thread collection. And I'm going to quilt directly over some of those feather meanders to give it a pop of color. But I'm not going to quilt over all of them. I'm going to focus on the designs that are close to the edge of the block. This is definitely an adventurous quilting technique. We're going to be trying to quilt on top of the line we quilted previously. You never really know what it's going to turn out like until you're finished. So if you're going to try it, try to relax and just enjoy the process. But don't worry if it's not perfect. Once you step back, you're going to see that subtle thread coloring that's just going to look beautiful. That's also why using a blending thread color for the first layer is really helpful, because if I don't get it perfectly on the line, that quilting kind of disappears anyway, so it's not super noticeable. Since I'm going to use that orange thread around the block, I'm going to have to jump from design to design, so I'm not super worried about keeping it perfectly on the line. I'm just trying to get it close. There are a couple things you can do though to make it a little less stressful. First of all, try a lighter thread. So if you're matching your thread colors to your quilt or your panel, you can use the coordinating threads that I suggest, or you can go a shade or two lighter. It's a lot easier to build up thread color than it is to lighten it. Now this is definitely going to result in a lot of quilting on the center of this quilt. So maybe this isn't the perfect technique for a baby quilt or a quilt that you want to cuddle with, but definitely for those quilts that you want to make a big impact with the quilting. So you might think with that bright orange thread that it was going to be very drastic on the quilt, but as you can see, it's fairly subtle. So I have my orange just nice and close to the block, and I have my gray that's quilted, and it just has that kind of subtle pop of color. Now you might be thinking, why go to all the effort to add that light gray thread first and then build up the colors on there? Well, I want it to be more of a subtle transition, and where you see that gray pop through or where the orange doesn't quite cover it, it's going to help it kind of blend from one color to the next. Of course, if you don't like that effect, you can skip that first part altogether. Quilt your first section in the orange and then quilt your next section in the gray. Really, it's like a choose your own quilting adventure. You can do whatever you like. I'm going to move it to the long arm so we can see what it looks like when I start incorporating another color into that thread painting. I'm going to quilt right over the top of the feathers that are close to the block with my pink lemonade thread from the coordinating thread collection. Even though it looks bright, you can tell it's going to be just a subtle hint of pink. If that's too dark, you could always opt for a cotton candy color, which is a couple shades lighter. So I'm just going to quilt it just about a couple inches away from the edge of the block, and I'm going to work my way all the way around. It may seem really drastic up close, but when you back out, you can just see just a hint of that little bit of pink. And as I'm going, if I want to build up the color a little bit more, I can backtrack over my previously quilted lines. It really just depends on how much color I want to add with the quilting. Now I'm actually going over my lines a couple times so that it'll show up on camera, but just know that you can make it a lot more subtle by not doing this. Now I know I've already said this, but it definitely is worth repeating. You don't have to quilt over it exactly the same way you've quilted it. Feel free to hop in between your designs and to quilt the areas that you want to quilt. Now I'm going to continue working along the other side of the block. Now what's fun about this technique is you can take it as extreme as you'd like. If I wanted to keep adding a little bit more on top of it to build up that color, I can. If I want to add another color to slightly change it, definitely. The trick is just to keep going until you're happy with how it looks. If you quilt it and you think, that's a little too dark, a little too drastic, instead of taking it out, I would put that light gray thread back in and quilt directly over the top of it. And that's just going to help mute it a little bit and keep it from being so vibrant. Once I'm done with the pink, I'm going to work my way around that blue block. I could use the haze glide that came in the thread collection, but if you're a little nervous, it might be just a bit too dark for you. If that's the case, you might try to find a lighter blue so it's not quite as obvious. Now, whether you decide to go all out with the thread painting or to just try to add a bit of color, this is definitely a technique you should try. All right, it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for the challenge, fill in the area behind your blocks with the feather meander. You can quilt it nice and big or shrink it down to make a tight filler. And if you're feeling adventurous, grab that coordinating thread collection and try layering the colors to create a beautiful effect. If you need just a little bit of help with that feather meander, check out my free downloadable tip sheet and quilting diagrams. Practice tracing over the design over and over until it clicks, and read up on extra tips to help you be successful with this design. And if you want just a little bit more help, you can check out the expanded resource, several pages with even more tips, quilting diagrams, and suggestions. And you can find all of that in the description box below, or visit my website, fmqchallenge.com. And I'll be back next week with the next video in the Fabulous Feathers Free Motion Challenge. Until then, happy quilting!